A man stood in a six-bedroom mansion worth $10.5 million, 3 elevators humming behind marble walls, while 20,000 people who used to fill his church every Sunday quietly stopped coming. No press conference, no public exit, just empty seats, one Sunday after another, until an arena built for 45,000 started echoing. What could make that many people walk away from a place that once felt like the center of their world and never explain why? This isn't a story about one bad sermon or one viral clip. It's about a promise made to hundreds of thousands of people over 25 years. And what happens when that promise quietly stops being believed? Picture the old Compaq Center in Houston, the arena where the Rockets once won championships, transformed into the largest sanctuary in America. 16,800 seats in the main hall, plus overflow rooms built to catch the crowd that couldn't fit. On a good Sunday, 45,000 people came through those doors, and millions more watched from home in over 100 countries. That was Lakewood Church at its height, an empire Joel Osteen built from a congregation his father left him in 1999, 6,000 members strong, grown into something the size of a small city. It wasn't a hard sell. It was a relief. For people exhausted by guilt-heavy religion, Osteen offered something different: faith without the fire and brimstone, blessings without the burden, victory over circumstance instead of quiet suffering through it. You didn't have to feel small in front of God. You just had to believe and give and speak positivity into your life, and the abundance would follow. Millions of books sold, sermons broadcast worldwide, a personal fortune estimated by Forbes somewhere between $50 and $100 million, built not on a church salary, but on publishing deals and speaking tours. A message like his could generate at global scale. Watching a service back then felt closer to a Broadway production than a traditional church. Cinematic lighting, studio-quality music, Osteen always smiling, delivering good news that cost nothing to receive. No talk of sin heavy enough to weigh you down. Just a promise, repeated in 100 ways. Your best life is still ahead of you. For people raised in stricter, harder churches, this felt like sunlight after years indoors. But somewhere in that success was a quiet contract nobody read closely enough. If faith brought blessing, then blessing was supposed to show up. And for a long time, enough people believed it would that nobody asked what happened when it didn't. That question would take years to surface. It would take a hurricane, a wall full of hidden cash, and one sentence from the pulpit that nobody could unhear. Keep that in mind, because everything that unraveled Lakewood Church started small, and each piece made the next one impossible to ignore. The first crack came in August 2017, when Hurricane Harvey tore through Houston and displaced more than 30,000 people. Shelters filled within hours, and there stood Lakewood, a 16,000-seat building on high ground, built to hold tens of thousands, sitting closed. The church said the building was flooded, inaccessible. Then the photos started circulating, the parking garage dry, the surrounding streets clear, nothing matching the explanation given. People who had been told for years that this was a house of abundance watched it hesitate at the exact moment abundance was needed most. Osteen said they'd always intended to help, that they were waiting on an official request from the city. Maybe that was true, but intentions don't photograph. Well, next to an empty shelter beside a flooded neighborhood, the doors opened eventually, under pressure, and Lakewood did shelter displaced families. Yet the delay stuck. It became the first quiet crack in a surface that had always looked flawless. Not a scandal loud enough to make headlines for long. Just a doubt, small and persistent, that some members couldn't fully set back down. Doubt has a way of waiting patiently for company. It found it 4 years later, in 2021, when a plumber doing routine repairs found something strange sealed inside a bathroom wall at Lakewood. Envelopes, stuffed with cash and checks, hundreds of them, roughly $600,000, traced back to a theft from the church's own offering plates in March of 2014. 7 years unsolved, until a stranger with a wrench found what investigators never had. Osteen was never accused of anything. The case stayed open, unresolved. But here's the detail that lingered longer than the theft itself. The church had already been paid out by insurance for that missing money, years before the cash turned up hidden inside its own walls. So members were left holding an uncomfortable question. If a church built its identity on trust, that giving mattered, that the money moved somewhere meaningful, what did it mean that $600,000 vanished into drywall for 7 years unnoticed? Nobody accused anybody of wrongdoing, but silence has its own weight, and this silence sat heavy in a place that preached transparency, was between you and God, never really addressing why nobody noticed a small fortune sealed behind tile. Something was coming that would connect all these threads directly to the theology itself, not just the money, but the meaning behind it. That reckoning arrived in September 2023, and it came from Victoria Osteen, Joel's wife and co-pastor, in a sentence that took about 15 seconds to say and years to stop echoing in the minds of the people who heard it. Standing before the congregation, she told them that worshiping God wasn't really for God. It was for themselves, because that's what makes God happy. The clip spread fast, and it landed like a confession nobody meant to make. For centuries, most Christian teaching held that worship exists to glorify God, not the worshiper. Victoria's comment flipped that quietly, almost gently, and in doing so said out loud what critics had suspected about Lakewood's theology for years, that the center of gravity here wasn't God. It was you, and what you could receive. Joel defended his wife, insisted her words were taken out of context. But context didn't change what people had already heard. And for members who'd spent years sensing something transactional in the sermons, this was the moment the feeling got a name. Faith here wasn't surrender. It was strategy. Give, believe, speak positivity, and receive. A formula, dressed in scripture, promising an equation would balance if you just had enough faith to trust it. Formulas are supposed to work, and for a long time, nobody talked too loudly about what happened when they didn't. You gave faithfully. You spoke victory over your circumstances the way you were told to, and your bills stayed the same. Your health didn't change. Your marriage didn't heal. Meanwhile, the man delivering that promise lived in a $10.5 million home in River Oaks, 6 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, 3 private elevators, a guest house alone worth nearly $3 million. No longer drawing a church salary, his wealth instead flowing through books and speaking fees the ministry's platform made possible. Lakewood itself reportedly brought in $90 million a year. None of that proved wrongdoing, but it made the math awfully hard to ignore for someone still waiting on their blessing, tithing faithfully into a system where the visible abundance seemed to only ever flow one direction. This is where something quieter than anger set in: disappointment. The kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just stops showing up one Sunday and never comes back. Former members describe it less as losing faith in God and more as losing faith that this particular room had anything left to offer them. The sermon started to feel like reruns. Smile. Believe. Speak victory. Stay positive. Comforting, maybe, the first 100 times. But life is not always smiling. Grief doesn't stay positive on command. And a theology with no real room for suffering, for unanswered prayers, for the person still waiting on a miracle that never came, eventually starts to feel less like faith and more like performance. Younger members in particular began asking a harder question, one the sermons never addressed directly. If believing in God brings prosperity, what does it mean about the people who believe and remain in pain? What does it say to someone doing everything right and still drowning in debt? Still sick, still alone? Lakewood's message never evolved to answer that. It stayed exactly the same, polished and cheerful, while an entire generation raised inside prosperity theology started quietly asking whether the promise had ever been designed to be kept for them, or only for the person standing at the pulpit. And so they left, not all at once, not with protest signs or public statements, but the way water leaves a cracked container, slowly. Then all at once you notice it's nearly empty. 20,000 people, roughly, stopped attending Lakewood Church. Overflow rooms that once needed extra chairs sat closed. Parking lots that used to fill before sunrise now had visible gaps. And still, every week, the cameras rolled. The lighting stayed perfect. The broadcast reached its audience in over 100 countries because a production built at that scale doesn't stop for empty seats. It just performs a little emptier than before. Here's what makes this different from every other megachurch controversy you've heard about. There was no single scandal big enough to explain 20,000 departures. No lawsuit, no criminal conviction, No moment where the whole structure publicly cracked. What happened at Lakewood was slower and more damning. A congregation that simply stopped believing the promise would come true for them, one quiet Sunday at a time, until the math of who was leaving became too large to hide behind a well-lit stage. That moment wasn't a single event. It was an accumulation. Harvey's closed doors, the money in the wall, Victoria's sentence about worship being for yourself, the mansion beside the empty bank accounts of the faithful, each one small enough to explain away individually, all of them together impossible to keep explaining away. You can forgive a delayed response to a hurricane. You can chalk up a wall full of cash to an old unsolved mystery. You can even argue a sentence was taken out of context. But when the pattern repeats enough times, forgiveness starts to look a lot like denial, and eventually the congregation stopped being willing to call it anything else. What's striking is how little anger there was in the exodus. Former members rarely described fury. They described fatigue, a slow, tired realization that the breakthrough they'd given toward for years simply wasn't coming, while the people telling them to keep believing seemed to be doing remarkably well regardless. There's something heartbreaking in that quiet exit, not slamming the door, just realizing nobody would notice if you didn't come back, and leaving anyway, because that's the real cost buried inside this story, underneath the numbers and the headlines. It's not really about one preacher, or one mansion, or one wall full of cash. It's about what happens to a person's faith when hope gets treated like a transaction, when belief becomes something you're told to perform in exchange for a result that never arrives. Some of those 20,000 people left organized religion entirely. Others found smaller churches, quieter ones, places without the lighting rigs and the broadcast deals, looking for something that felt less like a show and more like the truth. And some are still out there, not attending anywhere, just sitting with the uncomfortable question of what they actually believed all those years, and what part of it was ever really theirs to begin with. Lakewood Church still stands. The lights still come up every Sunday. Joel Osteen still preaches to whoever remains, and to the millions still watching from home, and the broadcast still reaches 100 countries, technically unchanged from its glory days on paper. But something essential shifted the moment 20,000 people decided, individually and without coordination, that the story being told from that stage no longer matched the life they were actually living. That's not a scandal you can fix with a statement. It's a trust that doesn't come back once it leaves, no matter how good the lighting is. Maybe that's the real lesson underneath this whole story. Not really about Joel Osteen at all, but about what happens whenever a promise gets sold at scale. The bigger the platform, the further the gap can stretch between what's said and what's lived before anyone notices it's grown too wide to ignore. Trust rarely collapses all at once. It erodes, week by week, in ways too small to name, until the room is half empty and nobody can say when it started. Faith, at its best, was never supposed to be a formula. It was supposed to hold people through the seasons when nothing about life added up, when prayers went unanswered and the breakthrough didn't come on schedule, no matter how many times it was spoken over in faith. What 20,000 people ultimately rejected wasn't God. It was a version of hope dressed up as a transaction, sold from a stage too polished to admit that some seasons don't resolve into blessing no matter how hard you believe. And somewhere out there, scattered across smaller congregations or no congregation at all, 20,000 people are still looking for that version of faith. The one that doesn't ask you to perform your way into a blessing. The one that was there the whole time, quietly, underneath the lighting rig nobody thought to turn off.